year is 1793. The disease known as yellow fever is sweeping through an immense number of states throughout the nation. The earliest fatalities began in July, and the disease did not end until the frost arrived in November. Many states were affected by the disease, but Philadelphia had one of the most lethal outbreaks. The world would not be rid of this disease until Walter Reed and several other scientists would eventually find a cure. The serious yellow fever epidemic of 1793 and the finding of its cause was a turning point in history because it forced the medical field to have to adapt and move forward dramatically. Yellow fever was brought to the United States by way of Caribbean refugees. However, the disease originated in South America and sub-Saharan Africa, which is where yellow fever is most commonly seen. Yellow fever is a viral infection carried only by female Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. The disease is what is known as a flavivirus, which is a virus that is spread by mosquitoes. If a person was bitten by a mosquito carrying the disease, then they would begin to get their symptoms 3 to 6 days later. Some of the symptoms were irregular heartbeats, bleeding, coma, delirium, fever, yellow skin and eyes, seizures, and vomit, which could often include black vomit or the vomiting of blood. In severe cases of the disease, comas and kidney and liver failure were some of the problems. Of the extremely severe cases, up to 50% of the afflicted people would die. Unfortunately for victims, there would be no treatment until the turning point in medical history. Dr. Benjamin Rush is the most well-known doctor that was in Philadelphia during the epidemic of 1793. He said,
"Dissections daily convince us of our ignorance of disease and cause us to blush at our prescriptions."
Rush wrote that the air seemed to be infected because of all the mosquitoes and dead bodies. In fact, gravedigger Sebastian Ale died from yellow fever, which he received from the dead bodies. Doctors found that when wind came from the north, more patients were cured, but when wind came from the south, the number of patients that died multiplied. Although Rush and other doctors worked to treat yellow fever, some of the popular methods, such as bleeding the victim, did not work. As Dr. Benjamin Rush said,
"The art of healing is like an unroofed temple, uncovered at the top and cracked at the foundation."
Although vast numbers of people fled Philadelphia, famous politician Thomas Jefferson stayed in the city and wrote letters to the father of the Constitution, James Madison, and informed him of the rising death toll. He also kept in touch with Benjamin Rush during the epidemic concerning the effect on our country. In a letter to Rush, Jefferson said,
"The yellow fever will discourage the growth of great cities in our nation."
The effect yellow fever had on the afflicted cities was overwhelming. So many people had an extreme fear of getting the disease that many of them left their dying family members. During the first half of September 1793, when the disease became increasingly serious, large numbers of people fled the city of Philadelphia to find safety. Many people during the time were poor and unable to pay for medical assistance and the doctors that they needed. As a result, 7 out of 8 people that died from the disease were poor and could not supply themselves with medical help. When frost finally arrived in November of 1793, the yellow fever epidemic would have caused over 100,000 deaths and 500,000 illnesses, and it would have become a turning point in history because it would have dramatically decreased the population in cities across the nation. Little did they know that the disease would keep coming until Walter Reed and several other scientists would find a cure. When the frost arrived in November, it killed off the disease for Philadelphia. However, people would soon find out that the disease was far from gone. Yellow fever would return once again in 1801, 1884, and 1904, striking down more people and causing more devastations. It wasn't until the early 1900s that the cure would be found. Born September 13, 1851, in Virginia, Walter Reed would soon become a hero in the research and curing of yellow fever. In 1869, Walter Reed graduated at age 17 from the University of Virginia, becoming the youngest to ever graduate from medical school. He then went to Bellevue Medical College to get a second medical degree at age 18. Walter Reed, James Carroll, Aristides Agremont, and Jesse Lazier were all active scientists and doctors during the epidemic. They would form a commission together, with Walter Reed first in command and James Carroll as second in command. Born in England in 1854, Carroll was drafted into the Army and moved to the United States, where he was enlisted at the age of 20 in 1874. Aristides Agremont was born in Cuba and came to America at the age of 3. Jesse Lazier had previously done work with malaria and yellow fever before joining the Yellow Fever Commission. In the year 1900, Walter Reed received permission from the military to set up a research facility near the Columbia Barracks in Quemados, Cuba, which was on the outskirts of the capital city, Havana. Reed eventually named this facility Camp Lazier, after his late colleague Jesse Lazier, who died during the first phase of testing in September 1900 after inoculating himself with the disease. It was at this camp that Reed, Carroll, Agremont, and other volunteers of the Yellow Fever Commission would research the cause of yellow fever. On October 23, 1900, U.S. Army Major Walter Reed presented the theory that mosquitoes were responsible for the transmission of yellow fever to the American Public Health Association in Indianapolis. This was a month after Lazier's death. The first phase of experimentation with the fever included inoculation on different people, including some self-inoculation done by Lazier, Carroll, and a private that was also in the commission. Inoculation is when they would inject themselves or someone else with the disease. Jesse Lazier inoculated himself twice with yellow fever, once on August 16th and again on September 13th, which was what caused his death a week later. James Carroll also inoculated himself with the fever, but he did not die from it. A telegram sent to Lazier's wife, Mabel, stated,
Mr. Lazier died at 8 this evening.
After Lazier's death, and upon his return to Cuba, Walter Reed designed a new study protocol. During the second stage of experimentation, inoculation continued, but a new system was also developed so more testing could be done. Volunteers received the disease through body fluids and the clothes of those that were confirmed to have had yellow fever. Volunteers were also injected with the blood of those that had yellow fever. It was during this second phase that the idea of mosquitoes transmitting the disease was agreed upon by those working at Camp Lazier. Before, several volunteers had doubts about the idea. In August 1901, Phase 3 of experimentation began, and the experimenting moved to Havana. The structure of the experiments was more efficient and well planned at this stage, and more blood injection incidents took place. By this point, the mosquito theory was known to the world by way of Walter Reed.
Volunteering to Dr. Carroll for experimental yellow fever was, I can assure you, a cold-blooded business proposition. There were no heroics in it as far as I was concerned. I suspected that I would probably get it spontaneously anyhow, so I decided I'd rather have it under favorable circumstances.
These were the words of a volunteer at Camp Lazier named John Bullard. After the long, hard work the volunteers at Camp Lazier put into their research, Reed's theory that the deadly disease of yellow fever was spread by wave mosquitoes was proven true. Hard work and perseverance helped to change a nation and advance the medical field. Many people died for the research of this disease, potentially saving countless lives, showing how much of a turning point in history finding the cure for yellow fever really was.